buried alive. The terrifying fight against the shadow within. Hook. What if your deepest fear wasn't something outside you, but something lurking inside your own mind? Imagine being buried alive, fighting against a shadow that refuses to let you go. But what happens when you stop running and face it head on? Can you conquer the darkness that haunts you? Stay tuned, because the terrifying truth is more chilling than you could ever imagine. Don't blink. The story is about to take a shocking turn. Watch till the end. You won't believe what happens next. The earth was cold, damp. Darkness pressed in from all sides. A heavy weight, unbearable. Jenna's breath came in sharp, quick gasps. Her fingers scraped against the rough, crumbling walls of her narrow prison. She tried to move, but there was no room, no space. She was suffocating, the air thick, stale. Every inhalation seemed to push her further into panic. Her chest tightened, as if the earth itself were closing in on her. She had been buried alive. The thought surged in her mind, sharp and piercing. How long had it been? Minutes? Hours? The dark around her was absolute. No light, no sound. The only thing she could feel was the trembling of the ground beneath her, the vibrations of distant noises, muffled and distorted. Her heart raced, hammering against her ribs. She tried to call out, but her voice was swallowed by the thick walls of dirt and stone. The silence screamed in her ears. Desperation clawed at her insides. She couldn't breathe. Her limbs were stiff, bruised from the weight pressing down on her. Her fingers brushed something cold. A small, smooth stone? It felt wrong, unnatural. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. She could dig, but the dirt was heavy, too heavy. Each movement felt like a battle. She pushed against the soil, her fingers raw and aching, but it was as though the earth itself fought back. Something shifted above her. A crack, a shift. Her heart leaped. Could someone hear her? She held her breath, straining to listen. A distant sound reached her. A whisper, a voice. She pressed her ear to the ground, but it was too faint. She couldn't tell if it was real. The silence returned, deafening, all-encompassing. Jenna's mind raced, spiraling into fear. Was she truly alone? Then, suddenly, the walls around her shifted. A loud rumble. And then, the crushing weight pressed down harder. Jenna's chest collapsed under the pressure. Her lungs screamed for air. She gasped, but the earth had sealed her in. Her hands trembled, nails digging into the dirt, as if clawing her way to freedom. But it was futile. She was trapped. The weight on top of her grew unbearable. The earth felt alive, shifting, closing in. A sickening, slow crush that made her head spin. She couldn't focus. Her vision blurred, dizzied by the crushing force. Panic surged again. Her throat closed. Her breath shallow and frantic. Then a sharp sound. A crack. A shift. For a moment, Jenna thought it was her mind playing tricks. But no, there was something stirring above her. Her heart skipped. Could someone be there? Could someone be digging? She held her breath, straining to listen. The faintest noise, a scraping sound, the distant echo of metal against stone. She could hardly believe it. Was this real? A burst of hope flared within her, only to be swallowed by doubt. Would they get to her in time? The noise grew louder, closer. Jenna's pulse quickened. Her fingers scrambled in the dirt. The earth above her trembled. The sound of digging was now frantic. It was happening. Her body was nearly immobile, but she willed herself to move. A jolt ran through her. The weight above her shifted. Then, a sudden crash. The ground above her cracked, wide open. Light. A sliver of light. Her heart soared. But then, a hand, a gloved hand, reaching down into the darkness that Jenna's breath hitched. The hand reaching, trembling. She stretched her own hand toward it, her fingers aching to grasp it. Her mind raced. This was it, her chance. But the hand hesitated. A moment of stillness. Then, as if sensing her desperation, it descended faster, fingers curling around hers with a firm grip. She gasped, a mix of relief and fear flooding her. Her heart pounded in her ears as she felt herself being pulled, yanked upward through the debris, each movement jerky, painful, but promising freedom. The weight of the earth above her slowly lifted. Her body scraped against rough rocks, dirt falling in heavy clumps, but she didn't care. She was moving. Jenna's head broke through the surface, cold air rushing into her lungs. The world was suddenly too bright, too loud. She blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the overwhelming sunlight. Then she saw the face above her, a man, eyes wide with intensity, lips parted in silent urgency. "Come on." He pulled harder, his grip unyielding. Jenna's legs kicked beneath her, her body weak from the confinement, but the promise of safety kept her going. With one final heave, she was free. She collapsed into the open air, gasping for breath, her body trembling. The man knelt beside her, his hand still gripping her arm, his breath heavy, his face pale. "You were buried for so long," he whispered, his voice strained. Jenna couldn't respond. She could only stare at the sky, the endless blue above her, feeling the dirt still clinging to her skin. But as she lay there, she heard something, a sound low and distant, a rumble. Not from the earth, but from the shadows above. The rumble grew louder, closer. Jenna's body tensed, her mind racing. What was that? The man beside her froze, his eyes darting around, his grip tightening. They both looked up. The sky was clear, no clouds, but the ground beneath them trembled again, a deep, unsettling vibration. Jenna felt it in her bones. Her chest tightened. Something wasn't right. The man glanced at her, his face pale, eyes wide with growing fear. "It's not over," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Suddenly, the ground gave way. A crack split the earth beside them. Jenna jumped back, her heart hammering in her throat. From the fissure in the earth, something emerged, a figure, dark, shadowed, too tall. The air turned cold, and a stench filled her nostrils. It moved quickly, its long limbs stretching unnaturally. Jenna's blood ran cold. The man beside her was already on his feet, his face contorted with fear. He reached for something at his side. A shovel? A pick? But the figure didn't wait. It lunged toward them. Jenna screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the crushing roar of the earth splitting. She turned to run, her legs unsteady, but she felt the man's hand slip from hers. He had fallen behind. The earth shook again, and the figure was closer, its dark shape looming over her. Jenna's mind raced. She could feel the cold hand of death on her back. The shadow reached out, its fingers elongated, touching her arm. A sharp, burning sensation shot through her. She screamed again, but there was no escape. The earth was closing in, the shadow consuming her world. Jenna twisted, trying to break free. The cold fingers gripped her tighter, pulling her toward the ground. Her breath came in panicked gasps, her vision blurring. The shadow loomed over her, its form monstrous, its presence suffocating. She couldn't move, her body frozen, caught in its grip. The ground shook violently, and the air became thick with a strange, heavy energy. She felt it inside her, a cold, dark force seeping into her skin. The shadow's face was obscured, but she could feel its eyes on her, burning, piercing. It whispered in a language she didn't understand, a low, guttural sound, sending chills down her spine. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no escape. She could hear the man's voice faintly, calling out, his words lost in the cacophony of the earth's rumbling. The grip on her arm tightened, the pain sharp and unbearable. Her vision swam, her head spinning. Suddenly, the earth beneath her cracked open further. The ground buckled, and she was pulled down, dragged deeper into the dark. Her body fell, her scream echoing through the void. But there was no sound, just the deafening roar of the world collapsing around her. The shadow was everywhere now, surrounding her. And then, nothing. The darkness swallowed her whole. Jenna's body hit the cold, wet earth with a sickening thud. She didn't move. Her chest heaved, but she couldn't catch her breath. The world was an endless black abyss, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. She lay there, unable to feel the ground beneath her. No sound, no movement. It felt as though time itself had frozen. Then, the faintest light flickered in the distance. A pulse of warmth, weak, but undeniable. Jenna blinked rapidly, her vision clouded with the aftereffects of the shadow's grip. The light grew brighter, drawing her in. It was a shape, a silhouette against the black void. She tried to move, but her limbs were numb, as if the earth itself had claimed her. Still, the light beckoned. Something within her pushed forward, a primal urge to survive. Her hands scraped against the ground, pulling her toward the glow. With each inch, the darkness seemed to pull away, the oppressive weight lifting, if only slightly. The light came closer. Jenna's heart raced, her hands shaking as they reached toward it. Then, as if she had crossed an invisible line, the light erupted, filling her vision. For a moment, she felt weightless, free from the suffocating grip of the shadow. The air around her was alive with energy, bright and pulsing. Then everything stopped. A voice, deep, familiar, echoed in her mind. Jenna, her body froze. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, demanding. She gasped, her heart pounding against her ribs. Jenna, wake up. The light around her flickered once more. And then she opened her eyes. Jenna's eyes snapped open. But the world before her was unfamiliar. It was daylight, bright, too bright. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the haze. Her chest heaved, and she gasped for air, feeling the warmth of sunlight on her skin. But everything felt wrong. Her surroundings were blurry, disjointed, like a dream she couldn't quite grasp. She looked around, disoriented. She was in a clearing, surrounded by dense trees, a strange, oppressive silence hanging in the air. The ground beneath her was soft, but the dirt felt fresh, new, like she had just been buried. Jenna's heart pounded in her throat. Where was she? What was happening? Her fingers trembled as she pushed herself to sit up, and then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, shadowed, but this time there was no mistaking its presence. It was the same figure, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. Its face was hidden, but she could feel its gaze on her, burning through the air. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. The figure stepped forward, slowly, almost deliberately. Jenna's body stiffened, her pulse racing. Please. Her voice trembled. Please, no more. But the figure said nothing. Instead, it raised a hand, a dark, long hand, its fingers elongated, almost inhuman. The air around them grew colder. The world around her began to blur again. Jenna tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Everything shifted, the trees around her twisting, the ground trembling beneath her. And then, a flash of light, so blinding, it burned into her vision. Jenna's body jerked, her eyes wide with terror. She reached out, but the light consumed her, and the world fell away. Jenna's vision flickered in and out, a haze of light and shadow blurring together. The light felt hot, almost suffocating. She gasped for breath, but the air seemed thinner, the space around her closing in. Her limbs trembled, heavy, unresponsive. A distant sound, like a hum, filled her ears. It grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. The light pulsed with it, a rhythm that seemed to match her racing heartbeat. Jenna's mind screamed, but her body refused to move. She tried to blink, but her eyelids felt like lead. The hum grew, and then a whisper, low, faint. It echoed in her mind. Jenna, her heart stilled. The voice, it was familiar. She strained to focus, to listen. The whisper came again. Jenna, you're not out. A shiver ran down her spine. The words were clear, but they made no sense. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice was swallowed by the hum, the pressure building in her chest. The ground beneath her shifted, tilting, spinning, and then, suddenly, the light vanished. The hum stopped. Jenna gasped, her body jerking upright. She blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was no longer in the clearing. She was back in the dark. The earth felt cold beneath her, her body raw and aching. Her hands shook as she pressed them against the ground, trying to push herself up. The air was thick, heavy, as though she were buried again. She pulled herself to her knees, shaking, and then she saw it, a shadow, the same dark figure, looming over her. Its eyes, or what she could see of them, glowed with an eerie light. Jenna froze. Not again, but the shadow stepped forward, its long fingers reaching out for her. It wasn't a dream. It was real. That Jenna's breath caught in her throat. The shadow's hand reached closer, its fingers curling toward her, cold, unnatural. She could feel the air grow colder still, a chill that sunk deep into her bones. Her body refused to move, paralyzed by the dark presence before her. The figure's face was obscured, but its gaze, she could feel it, a pressure weighing down on her. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Please, no more." But the shadow did not respond. It simply reached out further, its hand now inches from her face. Jenna's mind screamed, her instincts flaring with a desperate need to escape. But the weight of the air around her was too much, the darkness closing in on every side. In a frantic movement, she forced herself to stand. Her legs were unsteady, but she pushed herself forward, away from the shadow. Her heart raced faster than ever, her body trembling as she stumbled through the darkness. But the shadow followed. It moved as if it were a part of the night itself, fluid, silent, relentless. Jenna's feet slipped in the loose earth, her hands clawing at the air. The light from earlier flickered, barely visible in the distance. Her only hope. She ran toward it. Each step felt heavier than the last, the ground beneath her trembling, as though the earth itself was trying to pull her back. The shadow was gaining. It was closer now. Her lungs burned, her body desperate for air, but she could not stop. The light flickered again, brighter this time. Jenna could feel it drawing her in, but the shadow was right behind her, its cold fingers brushing against her back. She pushed harder, faster, her vision narrowing as the light grew larger. And then she felt it, the hand, not the shadows, a warm, solid hand, gripping hers. "Jenna, come on." The voice was familiar, strong. She glanced up. It was the man from before, the one who had pulled her from the earth. "Move," he shouted. Without thinking, Jenna took his hand. He pulled her with all his strength, away from the shadow that was now reaching toward them, its long fingers grasping at the air, desperate. The light enveloped them both, and with one final surge, they were gone. Jenna's vision blurred, the world around her spinning wildly. She felt herself being pulled forward, faster and faster. The man's grip was strong, firm, but the air around them felt thick, charged with an unearthly energy. The light was intense now, so bright it burned her eyes. She squeezed them shut, fearing that if she looked, she might be drawn back into the dark. The sensation of motion was almost too much to bear. Her stomach twisted, her limbs weightless, as if she were flying through space. Then, the light suddenly stopped. Jenna's body jerked, as if slamming into something solid. She gasped for air, her chest tight. She opened her eyes, but the world was different. It was as though she had crossed into another realm. The sky above was a sickly gray, the air thick with fog. She was standing in a vast, empty landscape, a wasteland stretching for miles in every direction. The man beside her was panting, his face pale, sweat dripping down his brow. Where are we?" Jenna whispered. Her voice sounded foreign in the eerie silence. The man didn't answer immediately. He scanned the horizon, his eyes darting around nervously. "This is the other side," he finally muttered. "The place in between." Jenna's heart skipped a beat. "The other side? The place in between? What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his eyes wide with fear. "It means we're not safe. And neither are you." A chill ran down her spine. Before she could ask another question, a sound reached them, a low growl. From the distance, shadows moved. The same shadow. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. There, just beyond the mist, she saw it. The figure, its dark form barely visible, but unmistakable. And then, the growl grew louder. The earth beneath her feet trembled again. "Run," the man yelled, grabbing her hand once more. They turned and fled, their footsteps pounding against the ground. But the shadow was closing in, fast. The man looked over his shoulder, his face filled with dread. "We have to get out of here, before it's too late." Jenna could feel it. The shadow was not just following them. It was hunting them. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as they ran, her legs aching, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadow was relentless, growing closer with every passing second. She could hear it now, the growl, low and menacing, pulsing through the air like a drumbeat of doom. The man's grip tightened on her hand, his eyes wide with terror. "Faster," he shouted, but the words barely registered. Jenna's mind was consumed by one thought. The shadow was getting closer. The landscape around them blurred, the mist thickening, the ground uneven and treacherous. Her feet stumbled over rocks, branches scraping her skin. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Behind them, the growl grew louder, closer, almost at their heels. Jenna's lungs burned, her chest aching with each breath. She felt the weight of the shadow creeping up on them, its presence pressing against her, suffocating. The man pulled her harder, his face twisted in fear. "I can't," he gasped. But then, suddenly, he stumbled. He fell to the ground with a heavy thud, his grip slipping from hers. "No," Jenna screamed, whipping around to grab him. But the shadow was upon them now. It emerged from the mist, its dark form towering, a twisted figure of inhuman proportions. Jenna froze. Her body was rooted to the spot, fear gripping her like an iron vice. The shadow's face was still hidden, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold, malevolent. It reached for the man, its long fingers curling around him like vines. His scream was cut off as he was dragged into the air, his body lifted and twisted, as though weightless in the shadow's grip. Jenna tried to move, but her legs wouldn't obey. She watched in horror as the man's body twisted in the shadow's grasp, his form contorted, his eyes wide with terror. Then, with a violent snap, he was pulled into the darkness. Gone. Jenna's body trembled, her chest tight with panic. The world around her seemed to collapse, the shadow pulling her in, closing in from all sides. But then a voice, not the shadows, a whisper, faint but clear. Jenna, it's not over. Her heart skipped. She spun around, searching frantically for the source. The mist parted for a split second, and there, in the distance, the light, the same light from before, flickering, faint but promising. Run, the voice urged again. With every ounce of strength left in her, Jenna bolted toward the light, her legs moving faster than she thought possible. The shadow screamed, its fury shaking the air. Jenna pushed herself harder, feeling the ground tremble beneath her. But the light was within reach. Closer, closer. She could see it now, a door, standing alone in the mist. The light from within beckoned her, pulling her forward. With one final sprint, Jenna reached it. She reached for the door handle, and just as the shadow's hand brushed her shoulder, the door swung open. Jenna slammed the door shut behind her, her heart racing in her chest. For a moment, there was only silence. The air was thick with tension, but the oppressive weight of the shadow had lifted. She sank to her knees, gasping for breath, her hands trembling from the ordeal. She looked around. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the stone walls. It felt cold, unwelcoming, but it was safe. For now, she slowly stood, her legs still weak, the memory of the shadow's grip lingering on her skin. The door behind her was solid, closed tight, but she could feel its presence, as if it were waiting, watching. A sound, a creak. Jenna's heart skipped. She turned. It was the door. It wasn't sealed. It was moving, shifting slightly, as if something was pushing against it from the other side. Her breath caught in her throat. She took a step back. The sound grew louder, the wood groaning under pressure. Then a voice, low, distorted, familiar. Jenna, her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It was the same voice from the shadows, the one that had whispered to her, the one that had pulled her into the darkness. She backed away slowly, her pulse racing, her mind spun with terror. How had it found her? But the door didn't open. Instead, the pressure on it increased. The wood splintered, cracking under the force. Jenna's eyes widened in horror. The shadow was coming for her again. She turned, looking desperately around the room. There was no other way out, no escape. The walls were closing in, the shadows deepening. The air grew colder, as if the very space was alive with menace. And then a low rumble. The floor beneath her feet began to shake, the ground trembling, as if something ancient and powerful was awakening. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The shadow was not just outside the door. It was everywhere. Jenna turned back to the door, watching the cracks spread, the darkness seeping through. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The shadow wasn't just hunting her. It was a part of her. The door shattered. The door splintered into pieces, and through the jagged opening, the shadow loomed. But this time, Jenna didn't run. This time, she faced it. Her breath was slow and steady now, the fear that once consumed her beginning to fade, replaced by something else, something darker, but more powerful. The shadow stretched into the room, its long, twisted form curling and writhing. It spoke again, its voice like the scraping of metal on stone. "Jenna, you can't escape me." She stood tall, her body braced for what was to come. The cold air around her was suffocating, but she no longer felt its grip. For the first time since she had awakened in the earth, she realized the truth. The shadow wasn't hunting her. It was a reflection of her own fear, her own darkness. With a slow, deliberate movement, she stepped forward into the shadow. The air grew thick around her, the space warping, the edges of the room blurring. But Jenna stood firm, her eyes locked on the shadow's shifting form. "You are a part of me," she whispered, her voice unwavering. For a moment, the shadow hesitated. It trembled, as though unsure of how to respond. And then, as if it had heard her words, it stopped moving. The darkness surrounding her began to dissipate, the air lightening with every passing second. The shadow's form started to dissolve, its inky tendrils curling back into itself, retreating into the corners of the room. Jenna took a deep breath, the weight in her chest lifting. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt the warmth of the light. The room was no longer cold, the shadows no longer suffocating. Jenna stepped back, her eyes scanning the room one last time. The door was gone, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The shadow had been defeated, not by escape, but by acceptance. And in that moment, she realized she was free.